All right, everyone, please take a seat. We got a couple more seats in the front. Y'all look beautiful. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And we're going to welcome, I'm sure more folks will trickle in, but we just want to get started. Is mic on? Everybody hear me okay? Yes. Say okay.
Okay.
My name is Tiff Beatty. I am the Associate Director here at the National Public Housing Museum. I'm going to be introducing tonight's program. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the museum, for those of you who are new. Anybody's first time here at the National Public Housing Museum? Awesome, welcome. Yeah, give it up for the new people. I say welcome, and also welcome home, especially to our public housing residents. This is your museum. We offer free museum for public housing residents, and lots of free programs for everyone. We're the first and only cultural institution in the United States dedicated to telling the story of public housing in the nation. Our mission is to preserve, promote, and propel the right of all people to a place to call home. Tonight's event, Plans That Did Not Transform, is presented as part of our Transformation event series, launched in 2025 to mark the 25th anniversary of the launch of Chicago's Plan for Transformation, the most ambitious public housing redevelopment initiative in U.S. history. For some, the plan represented the opportunity to address deteriorated buildings, unsafe housing projects, and entrenched racial segregation. For others, the plan was the cruel manifestation of decades of intentional neglect and abandonment of the city's most marginalized citizens. One of the first actions of the plan was the bulldozing of 11 public housing developments, resulting in forced displacement of tens of thousands of families without any guarantee of affordable replacement for all, housing for all. This demolition was the largest net loss of affordable housing in the U.S. In history. Today, many of these lands remain vacant or underutilized as the housing crisis and the decline of many other basic social safety nets continue to impact more and more people each day. As a museum envisioned by public housing residents, impacted by this plan and similar local and federal policy changes, and now housed here in the last remaining building of the Jane Addams homes, we bear witness to the displacement of Black and brown people, immigrants, refugees, whose lives and communities were erased from this place. We also acknowledge this land and the greater Chicago area is situated on the homelands of many indigenous tribes, who are the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And we continue to strive to understand and repair these injustices through our ongoing work. Tonight's event is part of this active commitment and is special for many reasons. One, it's our first event of the year and our first event of Black History and Futures Month. Give it up for that. Again, to those of you who this is your first event, if you found us on Eventbrite or through word of mouth, we welcome you to please check out our website. It's mphm.org. So that's National Public Housing Museum, our acronym .org/events to see our upcoming events. And if you're interested in potentially hosting your own event, this space and others in the museum are available for the community to rent or to build a partnership with us. And if you'd like to support our free programs and free admission or free memberships for public housing residents, please consider making a donation or becoming a member. And yeah, just please, if all the staff could also raise your hand who are in the room, thank you all so much for making tonight possible. Please come talk to us if you have questions. Also at the front desk, they can help you purchase something from the store or become a member or donate, and as well as just answer general questions. Okay, enough about us. Because we have the GOAT, David Stovall, in the building, I had to say that. With his latest work, Engineered Conflict, Structural Violence, and the Future of Black Life in Chicago. Raise up your book if you got a copy tonight. I think we are sold out, so give it up for that, for books. We still buy and love books and read them, please. I know we all buy so many books that we don't read, and maybe I'm just talking about myself. And Dave has signed. If you look in your book, you probably see that it's already signed. So Dave will also personalize books, I believe, afterwards. If you want it signed directly to you, you can hang out afterwards and we'll get those signed, as well as, well, let me get to that later. But let me introduce you to Dave if you are not familiar with Dr. David Stovall. Is a professor in the Department of Black Studies and Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His scholarship investigates 3 areas: 1, critical race theory; 2, the relationship between housing and education; and 3, the intersection of race, place, and school. In the attempt to bring theory to action, he works with community, organizations, and schools to address issues of equity, justice, and abolishing the school-prison nexus. His work led him to become a member of the design team for the Greater Longdale Little Village for Social Justice, aka SOJO, which opened in the fall of 2005. Furthering his work with communities, students, and teachers, his work manifests itself in his involvement with the People's Education Movement, a collection of classroom teachers, community members, students, and university professors in Chicago, Los Angeles, and San Francisco Bay Area who engage in collaborative community projects centered in creating relevant curriculum. In addition to his duties and responsibilities as a professor at UIC, he also has served as a volunteer social studies teacher at the Greater Longdale Little Village School for Social Justice from 2005 to 2018. Give it up for David Stovall. And tonight, Dave will be in conversation with rapper, record producer, comedian, and the National Public Housing Museum's 2026 artist as Instigator Open Mike Eagle. Over the course of more than a dozen solo and collaborative projects, Open Mike Eagle has helped push boundaries and redefine rap music as a genre and as a tool for self-expression, weaving personal history, humor, and social commentary into work that feels intimate and expansive at once. A native Chicagoan, now based in LA, we won't judge. His 2017 concept album, Brick Body Kids Still Daydream, is a tribute to the Robert Taylor homes, the former public housing project where members of his family lived before the high-rise complex was demolished as a part of Chicago's plan for transformation. As the National Public Housing Museum's 2026 Artist Instigator in Residence, Open Mike Eagle will develop an audio-visual project tentatively called The Sound of a Brick Body Complex to honor and celebrate the unheralded generations of families that have lived in public housing communities that no longer exist. Open Mike Eagle's album, Brick Body Kids Still Daydream, as well as his latest project, Neighborhood Gods Unlimited, are also both available in our museum store for purchase. And he's also offered to sign copies for you vinyl collectors. So there are a few signed already. And if you want to personalize, again, please stick around after the program. And again, just thank you so much for being here. And please enjoy Dave Stovall and Open Mike Eagle. Woo!
Check, 1, 2. How you doing this evening?
Man, look, it's thanks to all of y'all for making me feel hella popular.
Hey.
Damn.
It's a good feeling. And it's also a great book. It's a really powerful book, especially from my perspective, reading through it as somebody who grew up on the south side of this city. I found a lot of it very, very relevant and also revelatory for ways to look at my own experience that I hadn't really considered before. It starts off with a very powerful quote. The more complex a capitalist empire gets, the more unclear who the spontaneous target is, and the less people want to hit something of the empire, just each other. And my introductory question to you to start unpacking some of the things that you discuss in this book. What are the conditions that make in a system that make people want to hit each other?
I mean, and thanks so much, Mike, for agreeing to even engage with folks. And before I start, I just want to say publicly, and I think it's important, justice to our brothers and sisters in Palestine, justice to our brothers and sisters in the Congo, justice to our brothers and sisters in the Sudan, justice to our brothers and sisters in Haiti, justice to our brothers and sisters in Venezuela, right? And justice to our brothers and sisters in the Twin Cities, right? I think it's just important to say that out loud. But I think the conditions that allow for people to begin to hit each other and not see systems that are actually suppressing them is initial frustration, right? So when you think about being in spaces, and I always crack this joke, my parents came tonight, and when they used to go walk in a place called Mandrake Park, right there on 39th between Cottage and Lake Park, there was this sign on the park that used to say, "Come home to Kenwood." And I would always say, well, who's coming home? And under what conditions are they coming home to? Right? And what is home? And now in Chicago, you know, as a born and raised Chicagoan, I can find myself in certain parts of the city that if I don't take a lot of time, I might not know where I'm at.
Right.
Right? So it's this whole thing. And the thing that I think about, the one place that always kind of kicks that off to me is the corner, and it's going to sound strange to y'all, the corner of Milwaukee and California. Right? And it's because it's so wild, because when you look at it, so y'all, some of y'all remember the old Blue Line. When you would hit the California stop, it's like, all right, you know, it's a situation, right? Now, when you are on that Blue Line Cali stop, it's a party. I mean, it is a straight up party. I mean, there are thousands of people on that stop. So I'm always asking myself, if somebody knew this place as something else, when they come back to it, that frustration sets in. And now, what psychologists talk about all the time, much of our frustration is displaced on folks. And it's displaced on folks that we're in proximity to, right? So, you know, we see with little ones all the time, right? They are mad about something that they feel they cannot control, so they enact the anger on the person that they're in proximity to. And then we talk about them as acting out. But, you know, I will reveal my own frustrations, right? And I'm just saying, like, sometimes, you know, I always put this in conversation. Sometimes when I go to Randolph Street, I'm always like, I have this like fight for shy moment on Randolph, right? Every time I go, I'm like, I'm ready. I'm like, who are these people? Google black cars, I will snatch, like I'm ready, right? But that hypervigilance comes from a frustration. My uncles used to work in the meatpacking district, right? And that thing around being able to see that, and now it being something else, and being a place that I know that people who look like me and come from the same situations can no longer be in, albeit temporarily. Now you think about it differently, right? And so it's this frustration. So when you are pressed, when you don't have a place to live, when you don't have a viable place to educate yourself, when you don't have access to health care, those frustrations play out on the people that you are closest to, right? They don't play out on the broader system. So now those things really spark that frustration. And that to me is always a thing about Chicago. And, you know, I say this publicly, right? I need to figure that out for myself, right? Because I can't go on Randolph Street just snatching people out of black cars, right? That's not a good look, right? But at the same time, I know what that black car means. I know that every time that person who is worth a gajillion dollars steps out of that black car, that means that that place that they live, which is close by, becomes more and more inaccessible, right? And that, to me, I think that frustration builds, and sometimes you don't even know that you're frustrated by it, right? It's just this thing that sits in you, and it sits in you until something pops it, right? And I always think about What in a city can do that countless times to thousands of people at once? So that to me always, that's how I always think about those frustrations.
And in reading the book and sort of unpacking the policies that lead to that frustration, it starts to really seem like that a lot of the creation of that frustration is intentional through what you describe as engineered conflict. You describe this engineered conflict with 3 pillars, and I would love for you to explain to people what those 3 pillars are.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm trying to put in conversation in the book is I'm trying to ask myself this question. Can a city make you fight? Right? And can a city make you fight the people that you should be in solidarity with? Right? So this thing around, so if a city can make you fight, what mechanisms do they use to make you fight? Right? And I put it back to a conversation that I had with a police officer once. He was a retired police officer. And a guy that I played high school basketball with used to be on these things, and some of you all remember this, that we'll reference as a gang tactical unit. So he said, look, man, I know your work. I want you to talk to my old commanding officer. So I'm like, all right, cool. I'm already on enough lists, right? So I'm like, shit, all right. But he says this thing to me, and I'm like, man, it rung out to me. So we're on a 3-way call, and he says, look, he says, Stovall, I know about your work. I think you're right. But then he says, I want to tell you how to make a killer. I was like, He said, look, it's simple. You don't have a place for folks to live. You do not have a place for them to work. You do not have a place for them to be educated. You do not have access to health care. Then you hire me to contain them. He says, but you hire me to contain them with the hope that they will eliminate themselves in the process. And then he says, we know as a police department, no black child is born in any city with a natural propensity for crime. But we can create conditions that make sure that a certain group of them will be at each other. Right? He said it. So to me, that conflict, and one of my colleagues at UIC, Atif Saeed, he said, well, look, if something is being engineered, to what purpose is the engineering? And one of my colleagues at Loyola, her name is Catherine Cho, who was trained as an engineer in her undergrad. And she said, well, look, engineering is about the elimination of human error. So if I think about Chicago, who has become the error? And now who will we eliminate because they have been deemed the error, right? So now this kind of disposability. So how do people become disposable in this process? And what are the marks of disposability, right? So I'll date myself, y'all. There's I show my students a picture of payphones, right? And they always look like, what? You know, and it's always wait for that response. What is that? Right? And I'm always like, well, look, here's one of the early markers of disposability. And some of you all remember this story. So if you lived in certain parts of the south and west sides of the city, after 10 o'clock, payphones would be cut off. Right? So and the idea was to prevent people who had pagers from conducting drug transactions. Right? But this is what we also know. Some of you all remember this, and this is when the Chicago Police Department started to be really stealth in their operations. So some of you all remember police cruisers that actually had double letters in the license plate, and they didn't have MP on the license plate. So that actually becomes part of the practice of now all police cars have to have municipal police on the license, but they used to have these double letters on the front. But that wasn't for people to know that it was police. That was for other police to understand that there was another police officer, right? So, and they would also have, some of you all remember this, they would have these tactical uniforms that did not refract light. Right? So I remember on Stony Island, cop gets out of the car, and I'm like, man, I couldn't see him until I'm right up on him. Right? Because and it was night, and I'm looking at him saying, well, what are these practices of containment? Right? And before the teen takeover instant curfew that they wanted to pull, you know, at one time, police officers in Chicago could actually pull martial law in particular communities, right? So this thing around really being clear about that. So that engineering is saying someone has been deemed the error. We are in the process of eliminating it. And those who do not comply are disposable. And we will demonstrate their disposability by where we have them living, what schools they attend, and the practices of law enforcement when we talk about any type of conflict, right? So when we see this in real time, the first thing I thought about was those payphones, and then some of you all seen this, there's one left, not too far from me, but the red X's that used to be on buildings, right? And these red X's were markers for demolition, but they were also markers in some instances for development. So if a place was marked, something else was coming, right? So in Chicago, one of the ways that we saw this thing show up, every time a street is paved again, the question is always, who's coming? Right? So this thing around now, if we pay attention to that, now is me trying to put these things in conversation with each other and saying, well, if this is happening to you, you're under a certain set of stressors. And those stressors are not enacted on the system that has you stressed. Those stressors are enacted on the people that you are in proximity to. We are not talking about a gang problem. We are talking about a problem of structural disinvestment, white supremacy, and disinvestment. And I know those are too many syllables for the news feed, but at the same time, we have to have a more accurate conversation when we think about that conflict.
So you spend a lot of time in the book talking about the schooling aspect and the housing aspect and the policing aspect. Most of this conversation we're going to have today is going to be focused on the housing part. We're in the National Public Housing Museum. We're going to talk about the plan for transformation. But like I was saying earlier, as somebody who grew up on the south side of Chicago in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot about the school piece that felt really, really personal to me. So one of the things I wanted to do was sort of relate to you my schooling journey, and have you run that through some of the systems you describe in the book. So first to fourth grade, I went to an elementary school called John B. Drake in the Prairie Courts. I grew up in Lake Meadows, but I was at the school in the Prairie Courts. In fifth grade, I take a test to go to the gifted program at Alexander Graham Bell, all the way on the north side. And then for high school, I take another test and go to Whitney Young. And then since then, of course, Drake has been closed. And I'm curious for you what that sounds like through the lens of the schooling policies that you describe in the book.
So I do this with my students all the time. So if we split this room in half, you all are one school, you all are the other. I close you all, and then I send everybody over here. Now, this is always, Chicagoans answer this question the best, right? So if I close you all, send everybody here, what happens on the first day? Fights, right? Has anybody ever been in a fight that is so intense you don't even know who you're fighting? Right? You just sit there like, look, homie, what the scrap somebody, look, yo. And you can only figure out the person that you came to the fight with, be like, yo, is this one of them? Okay, yeah. That's the intensity of the moment. Do that 50 times in one summer. But more importantly, do that 150 times since 2004. So now, when we talk about that conflict, and we talk about that particular closing, and the rationale that CPS used when they talked about utilization numbers, and those utilization numbers actually did not take into account what was happening in those schools, right? And when we think about selective enrollment schools and your experience, like you said, from going from Drake to Bell, then to Whitney, those selective enrollment schools have this very unique racial composition in Chicago. Give you all an example. The city of Chicago used to be divided about a third in terms of Black, Latine, white folks with a mix of other groupings. If you go to selective enrollment schools currently, CPS is about 10% white. Selective enrollment schools are about 48% white, right? So this thing around, there's disparity in the design. So now when we think about, so how does that disparity play itself out? Who gets what under what terms? And now when we think about those schools, and this, one of the things while doing the book, and a point that a good friend of mine always made, there are 100 CPS schools currently that do not have libraries. Right? So this thing around, so let's put that in conversation, right? So what is the expectation of a place where a young person is that doesn't even have the initial resources for them to engage, right? So now you put that together and you think about where these schools were closed, right? You think about the South Side, you think about the West Side, and you think about that underutilization number that was kind of drawn up. And now you think about this current phase. This, when we think about housing and its connection to education, Chicago, and I'm quoting Eve Ewing, Chicago is in a process of literally de-blackening itself. So Chicago has lost 350,000 Black people since 1980. Almost 300,000 since 2000. So now when we think about this particular space, well, what would schools look like in a depopulating city? What would happen to them? What resources would be available? And now, if I look at the most depopulated schools, they are also in the most distressed neighborhoods, right? So we have this 1-to-1 ratio, and we have to ask that question around who is afforded. And it's no, because I think it's important, and I thank you, Mike, for this question, because I think it's important. It's not to be acrimonious towards selective enrollment schools, right? The issue is that every school does not have the same or the access that it needs, equitable access. So now we're asking a different question. And I think when we ask that question, there's no running from that disposability, right? We can see very clearly who has been demarcated, right? And in the book, I make this point because it's not to be dismissive of any other group's struggle. But when you look at schools and housing in particular, 88% of the schools closed in 2013 were over 85% Black. Public housing, until the plan for transformation, was running about 93% Black in terms of all the developments, right? So this is an issue that is explicitly hitting a certain group of Black residents in Chicago. And I think when we talk about schools, that disposability comes front and center when you walk into a place where there's no library, right? When you walk into a place that has yellow lines on the floor that say, please step to the right, and you have folks, young people who are instructed to walk in the hallways with their hands either in front or behind their back. I used to teach in Stateville. So the first thing I say to myself is, that's not a place that's conducive to education. You have now put the logics of the prison in a place where young people have been deemed disposable. And we think about it innocuously, right? Some of the people even say, no, oh, they look so cute in their uniforms. For me, it's always like, that's something else, right? And don't give me that class argument. That's a marker, right? And the 10th District the 10th District Chicago Police Department actually would say that, right? They would actually, because the 10th District has the most schools in it. And they say they would know the schools by the uniforms, right? So now when we think about this in real time, is putting us in an understanding of what education is connected to, but that disposability just rings so loud when we see where people are also struggling to have places to live.
And moving into the housing piece, there was another memory that I had reading the book about when I was at Drake University, Prairie Court housing projects. And I can remember I may have been in 3rd or 4th grade where suddenly all of the kids who went to the school that lived in Prairie Court, which was the majority of the students, they all suddenly had to have IDs to get in the building. And you talk about that as a policy called Operation Clean Sweep in the book that I hadn't heard about. So I'd love you to talk about that policy a little bit.
There actually is a really good movie that shows this. And I would encourage folks to check it out. It's by a Chicagoan, and it's called We Grown Now. It's a really good piece because they show what happens in Operation Clean Sweep, right? And this was, and actually a guy who had a very interesting history. So Ronaldo Johnson and a guy named Vincent Lane. Vincent Lane was the head of Chicago Housing Authority, and he actually thought about, well, what ways could we make sure or put drug dealers on notice, right? And one of the ways that they thought about it in the first place that they actually engaged Operation Clean Sweep was Cabrini Green, but then they moved to the Taylors, Stateway, and then Dearborn's, Ickes, Hilliard's. But this idea of regulating passage, the thought was if you could regulate passage, then there's the greater opportunity to say these folks shouldn't be here. But you know that doesn't work because of this thing in Chicago called Black life. And certain places are always marked where you shouldn't be here, right? UIC used to be heavy around who should be there or not, right? Ironically, UIC has an open arrangement with local schools where they should be able to use the space, but it still operates around who should be there. But the other thing that intensified this were these no-knock arrest warrants, right? Where they would actually enter people's homes, quote unquote, for suspected drug dealing or contact with someone who may have been in drug sales, right? So what it would do was just create a fever pitch. So people would come, now you got these IDs, and now when the sun sets, you have to worry whether or not your home would be raided. More importantly, if your home is raided and you respond also with interacting with folks, right? So we know the story of folks who respond to police who are unlawfully in people's homes and they still get killed, right? So now this section around that intensification where they thought was regulating movement actually just created a deeper conflict and higher tension, right? And ironically, Vincent Lane reflected on this. And he said that the thinking was around safety. The result was something different. And I think when we think about Operation Clean Sweep, it allows us to understand that the issue is never you will never arrest your way out of an issue. The way that you actually get yourself to address an issue is to first assess your relationship with people. So now you can understand what it is that they're going through, and then you can begin to do the work of addressing what folks need. This kind of hard, heavy police presence in a place that already received that just intensified the problem, right? And that actually made it a little more intense when you think about the Taylors and the wars that at one point GDs and MCs were having against each other in the Taylors, right? And how that really put folks on notice. But the issue was to try to arrest folks, not understanding what the tensions really emanated from.
So the number you just laid out about the lack of libraries in school just really struck me, and it's kind of been rattling around in my head since you said it. It wasn't in the book, but it reminds me of a lot of the facts you lay out in the book, and that they give you this feeling like all of these policies over all of these decades, all of these seemingly smart people that are in positions to make these decisions. And I'm curious from your perspective, how aware do you think people in these positions are of what the ultimate results of these decisions are?
Man, Mike, thank you for this question, because this came out to me in looking at the closure of one particular school. So many of us are familiar with Austin High School. So Austin is essentially on Lake and Austin, right? It's on, the street is actually Pine, but it's a couple of blocks off of Austin. Now, just a Chicago geographic question. Let me get my Jeffrey Bear on right now, right? So if you think about the geography of Chicago, there's a high school that's actually pretty close to Austin that we don't think about as much, right? There's a high school that's close to Austin. It's actually Taft. In fact, some people who live in the northern part of Austin go to school at Taft. So when they closed Austin, the first thing I said was, okay, well, where are they going to send young folks? They sent young folks to Roberto Clemente on the corner of Western and Division. So I'm just saying to myself, just as a Chicagoan, I'm saying, wait. Somebody in central office said, this is a good idea. We're going to send babies in a hyper-segregated city. Because see, again, this is not a gang issue, right? This is a segregation issue, right? Because in Chicago, the first test of a Chicagoan is, the first thing we're going to ask folks is where you go to high school. Where you stay at. Right? And then you get the funny look. Oh, you over there. Right? So I just said it out loud to myself. Okay, wait. They gonna send babies from Austin and Lake to Division and Western. The first thing I thought about was the bus route. Right? I was like, man, how you gonna get to? Man, I'm just thinking about Austin to Division and taking the Division bus from Austin to Western. What? I just kept saying to myself, man, no. And I remember having this frustration with a couple of homies, like, man, let's find the people who made this decision. Like, what are you thinking, right? But that thing around, if you think of someone as disposable, this is what you do to them. You put them in a harrowing situation, right? And to your point, a young person, and this is where we have to ask really tough questions of ourselves. When a young person makes a decision not to go to that school, we think about them as the dropout. I think about that as an informed decision. You are literally having me take the Austin bus to Division, 7 miles down Division to Western. And I'm supposed to be making it home daily. And I keep saying to myself, like, man. And so this thing around, they can claim ignorance, but it's just like the Trump administration. Somebody is in there right now at 1600 Pennsylvania like, fuck around with y'all. What are you doing? Right? But they are saying, someone is saying, no, dude, we good, bro. We can move this. Because what the city of Chicago did not expect was the resistance. I would argue that closure of those schools before 2012 actually led to some of the galvanization that created an organization called CORE that took over the Chicago Teachers Union. Right? So this thing around really putting that in context, but it was so laughable that I knew someone knew, right? So it was just too nonsensical. And then when we started to look at the paperwork, we'll just go back to housing, in the plan for transformation, and you know Chicago always got some type of plan. In the plan for transformation, they actually state that they do not have enough money. It's in the initial plan. Before they do it, they say they don't have enough money, right? And I'm saying to myself, well, they're forecasting this before this thing is even enacted. And to this day, only 38% of raised public housing has been replaced. Right? So this thing around, so they are forecasting this. So again, it's never the ignorance of the policymakers. It's literally the claim that they are making on people's lives, right? And when we're clear about that claim that they make, they move different. And that one, but the closing of Austin to me that one set me off to say, wait, this is something that is going to make for all types of matters. And I say this as somebody who took a bus from essentially Stony Island to Kedzie, right? Going to high school. And I was just, some days on the bus, you're like, all right, it could be good or it could go a different direction, right? So this thing around how we even understand that, right? And when you put thousands of young people in that situation, what's the expectation? And I think that's always what we're grappling with.
I mean, given that that's what the situation is, and I know you're writing the book from this place of raising awareness about these things, especially given what the ultimate cost is in our communities. But from your perspective, how do you feel we hold cities accountable for creating policies like this?
I think there's a number, so I always have this conversation with my students. Multifaceted issues require multifaceted solutions. And I think one of the things that folks do is this kind of fugitive work, right? To say, look, we cannot expect much from a place that has demeaned us. Because we can't, here's what we need to be willing to do, right? So I think about an organization like Ujima Medics, right? And they asked a very simple question. What do you do when you know the ambulance isn't coming? Like, very straightforward, right? So the first thing they say is, all right, here's what we're going to do. The first thing we're going to do, we're going to teach people how to treat folks who have been shot and how to stabilize them and get them to medical care, right? And just thinking about that was based on a young person being shot and all the ambulatory services not responding to him, right? So they saw it and they said, all right, well, look, here's what we're going to do. So a local firefighter teamed up with a nurse who was also an organizer, who teamed up with another group of organizers and said, here's what we're going to do. And then they started to think about, all right, now here's where we shift the work and say, well, if it's not just gunshot wounds, where are other people finding, where we also finding this suffering, right? So they're doing workshops about diabetes. They're doing workshops about hypertension, heart disease, right? With the understanding that the places that are supposed to be for you may not work, right? Or somebody like Equity and Transformation who says, all right, we want to put, if the city of Chicago is really serious about this, then what does it mean to talk about a guaranteed income? Right? And this is the thing that makes us think about this differently. So when we look at places like Stockton, California, and I would encourage folks to look at, it's called the Stockton Guaranteed Income Experiment, right? And it's a collaboration between Stockton and Stanford. And what they do, they give 500 families $1,000 a month for a year. And what they see, the economists at Stanford go crazy over. They're like, how is this possible? So against the innuendo and rumor of people spending their money on things that they don't need, 93% of the families in the Stockton experiment, when they first got the first check, paid bills. 95% of those same families went out and looked for work. So folks here in Chicago say, well, look, miss me on all this business about families not doing what they need to do. They know very clearly what they need. And if we do this, now can we rethink public assistance? So again, that's that type of pressure that folks can put on. But I think the work comes first in opposed to the pressure. The pressure people can organize and build towards, but let the work come first, right? And when people start to do that work, it shifts, right? So Let Us Breathe Collective, right? They get a text from Palestine, right? And they're down in Ferguson, Missouri, after the death of Michael Brown, and a group of Palestinian young folks say, you're about to get tear gassed. Here's what you need. So a group of young folks said, all right, we're going to take gas masks to Ferguson. They go to Ferguson, and then they say, well, we drove all the way down to Ferguson. What are we doing at the crib? So now the first time I saw Let Us Breathe, I was at a concert, ironically, and it was like a brand Nubian show, right? And we at Promontory, and there's a grouping of young people, and they have all these clothes racks, and it's all this stuff, and I'm like, man, who are y'all? And they're like, man, we the Let Us Breathe Collective. And I said, okay, well, what do y'all do? And they was like, yeah, man, we just want to make sure that people have what they need. This is a free store. What? And they're like, yeah, you know, just take it. It was funny. Like, younger brother, he was like, take what you need, brother. But just take what you need. But that type of piece around even thinking about that. And then they started to think about, well, what would that mean to house folks? What would that mean to feed folks? What would that mean to give folks what they need to now have time to plan about what they will do? And I think this becomes important because it shifts our thinking around traditional organizing, where it says there's a set of work that comes first. And once we have determined that work, then we actually start to think about who we need to pressure to make things happen, but the work being first.
Well, obviously, I could ask you questions about this book and this work all evening long, but we do have some feedback, some questions from people here in the room, so we wanted to get to a few of these if we have time to. The first one is there a connection that you see between the rise of drill culture and school closings?
This is a really interesting point. And thank whoever wrote that, thank you for that question, because I think we have to ask this question, but we need to understand the origin story of drill music, right? So let us not have a conversation about drill without talking about somebody named King Louis, right? And King Louis is important. King Louis is from Woodlawn, right? King Louis was valedictorian of his graduating class, right? And King Louis, when he first talked about saying, because he was the first person to use the term drill, he talked about it coming from frustration, right? He talked about, so what does it mean to actually talk about your frustration, right? And the frustration that you're observing, and now that you're seeing, because now you're living in this moment, you're looking, houses are coming down. People who were in conflict with each other for 40 years are now in the same space. So now his work reflects that, right? Then you get into the conversations about Keith. And really interesting, Keith, when he was at the juvenile detention center, one of my guys used to actually be one of his teachers in Nancy B. Jefferson, which is the school inside of the detention center. And he would always talk about Keith was very reserved. And now what is the thing that comes out? Because we also have to put this in the relationship of young people. Now, and I'm 53, right? I remember when I first saw I Don't Like. And there's this one scene where it's like 4 young cats and he's in front of the camera and they just like one of them like jumps in front of the camera and like rises up and like looks, and I was like, 16-year-old David Stovall would be on that. If the homies called me and was like, we shooting a video, yup, I'm there. And I'm about to jump in front of the camera, rise up, And then I'm about to go to lunch the next day and be like, you see me on that video, bro? Yes, right? So there's one thing that you have to put that in. But the other thing that you have to hear in some of the music is deep frustration, right? So I think about those closings. So to answer the question, yes, your development and rise of drill culture comes from displacement. Very similar to the origins of hip hop. Because when the Bronx was being burned down, there were people who created community space to be with each other. Drill has a very different relationship where people are antagonistic towards each other because, again, back to Tungo Easton Martin's point, you are frustrated at the people that you are next to because you cannot see the system that is doing this to you. So now it's a different type of space, and drill music exemplifies that frustration. It is not, and I always tell folks, it is never to excuse anything, but if we understand it, it gets us closer to being in relationship with people. It will not malign them. We can disagree, and I'm not bumping drill in my car, but at the same time, when a young person does, I'm not going to shun them for understanding their world in a particular way. I need to be in community with them to understand what's actually happening. But I think drill, without question, amped up that space where they now speak to that frustration, but the frustration is now interpersonal, in opposed to a frustration that's structural.
This question sort of touches on the last one I asked, but I think you're going to explore it a little further in this question. And it is, have you ever seen any space, either in Chicago or outside of Chicago, that has been re-engineered, post-engineered conflict for the better?
Beautiful question. And my direct answer is no. Right? And I think when you talk about any type of shift in infrastructure, which becomes shifts in culture, which becomes shifts in understanding, cities often do that absent of the people who will be affected most. So it's rare when a city will actually get to folks who are affected and say, well, here's what we do. And there's an excellent movie, two documentaries about this that are part of the same story. One is Voices of Cabrini, and then the second one is 70 Acres. And they actually show you the sham process that CHA put folks through, right? And that process actually was supposed to center community concerns. It did the direct opposite, right? It just ran over folks. It told people that they would have right of return. And then when they did not get that right of return, then they made the Hope 6 Section 8 voucher list available to people. And that list from the late 90s until the current moment can be anywhere from 3 to 5 years long, right? So now when we think about those practices, you don't see, there are small iterations of this, right? I don't want to, folks, like the point of tonight was not y'all to leave and just be like, Stovall say that's all terrible. No, right? That's not the point. But there are some spaces, like there's a small development in Cambridge, Massachusetts, that actually that was centered in community concerns, and then that development became run by its members. Now, there's a place here in Chicago that's like that. It's not given a whole lot of love, but I think it's important to note that these things exist, right? So if people are familiar with Wentworth Gardens, which are right at the Dan Ryan at 39th, that is a tenant-led development, right? And that was a hard-fought fight to get that tenant, that tenant development, right? The Horners, they tried to do a little bit of it in the Horners, but it didn't work in the same way. But Wentworth Gardens is still run by tenants, right? And again, the fight is perpetual, right? They are always on CHA around being able to maintain the fact of being tenant run.
This is the last one we'll probably be able to get to. This says, I am a UIC grad student in urban planning and policy. What do you foresee happening to the communities near major development projects like the Obama Center, United Center, etc.? And how do planners mitigate these issues?
Yep, I think, and thank you for that question because I live right up the street. And I remember I would go running in the morning and there was this sign that said, "We trust Obama." And I was like, shit, I don't. Right? And that, but what actually, because when it came, because here's the thing, y'all. They said they were having community meetings. Who makes a community meeting at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday? Who is coming to that? Right? In fact, nobody's coming, and the people who are coming don't want to be seen because those are the folks who are going to be displacing people. Right? So they had these meetings. We used to get the announcements in the mailbox. It's like, yeah, come to the meeting at 8 on a Saturday. Come on, people. And one day I just wanted to go to raise hell, but it was just like, you know what? It's not even, that's not even worth the energy because I know what that is. So this thing around it, you have to look at places like East Woodlawn, right? So East Woodlawn is what's east of Cottage Grove, right? So now the property taxes have increased over 300% in the last 15 years, right? Now they try to do something to mitigate this. They call it the Woodlawn Ordinance. The Woodlawn Ordinance says if you're 65 years old, your property taxes are frozen and you will never pay over the last bit of property taxes. Now, they try to be slick with this. That's already guaranteed by Cook County. Right? But here's the thing. If you pass away, you cannot pass that on to your next of kin. So now what that does is creates a mechanism for displacement. So now me and my partner, we get up in the morning, we go to the mailbox, open the mailbox, and they got this advertisement for a house with a 12-foot island. I was just like, damn, like I'm trying to envision what does a 12-foot island even look like in somebody's house, right? And that thing around those houses now start anywhere from $770 to $1 million, and the people get in a bidding war about them, right? So the first bid ain't even gotten, right? So the first bid doesn't even get the house, right? So this thing, we actually had $2 million homes sell in 2023. The first $2 million homes sold in Woodlawn were in March of 23 and then later in November, right? So now, what does that mean for family members who are long-term Woodlawn residents? They can't stay there. They can't stay there because either they have lost the house or they cannot pay the taxes, right? And the Obama Center sits in the middle of this. And he said to folks, when people pushed him for a community benefits agreement, he said, well, if I give one group of folks a community benefits agreement, I got to give the next one. Homie, who are you talking to? Who are you talking to, bro? It's like, man, look, that's telling me that you have actively refused to understand what a community benefits agreement is in the first place. Because if you sign one and somebody asks you for another one, you say there is one in place. What are we doing? See, he ain't really from Chicago. Quit playing with me. That's your homie, but he ain't. Yeah, I got a situation, right? But that thing around really thinking about that, right? So Woodlawn. So to answer the question, Woodlawn is in a fight. And if it were not for organizations like Southside Together, the Alderman Jeanette Taylor, it could potentially be worse, right? And I think what's in the future is people holding up that fight, because it's always this thing around development is always understood as good. For me, it's always for whom and under what terms, right? So now what when we think about a sustainable development, the people who are there have first priority to remain, right? And I think that's different thinking. And with the Obama Center, and they just made the announcement today that there's actually going to be a public library in the Obama Center, right? And this is always the thing. In many cases, and I saw this in New York first, they will create instances where there is a facade of the people who live there. It is not reflective of the situation that pushed them out, right? And that's when some people refer to this as cultural tourism, right? And we see this in certain ways, and I really appreciate the work of Sherman Dilla Thomas, because he lays out that history. Any place that you see, he's willing to kind of break it down and say, well, here's what used to be here, right? And I think when we detach ourselves from that, we detach ourselves from possibility, right? Because there are people who are resistant, right? So now we have to join that resistance. And I think one part of that resistance is to make sure that no more schools are closed in Woodlawn, to make sure that that living ordinance is, families can pass that on to the next of kin. And I think this piece around making sure that people have access to those properties that they have been locked out from on their particular block, right? Because on my block, there was a group of community members who built a garden, and literally they purchased the garden. They purchased the plot to build a garden, but that was them making sure that they were not further dislodged or displaced, right? So this struggle, again, is one that is continuous, but we have to be able to find where people are so we can do our work differently.
Well, thank you all for the questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of those, and I wish I had more time to ask questions myself. But we do have to wrap up now, and I just want to say before we do, just a genuine thank you for the book, thank you for the work, thank you for helping to unpack frustration that so many of us feel and have experienced in these environments. And it's so important for us to not look at, like you say, the individuals in the environment with us as the cause or as the targets of our frustration. It's so important to examine the systems that we all live in. So I think the book is really important and really resonated with me because of that. So I just wanted to say thank you for the work.
Oh, thank y'all. Really appreciate it.
And thank you to the National Public Housing Museum for
Indeed,
facilitating
thank y'all
a
so much.
wonderful event.
Truly appreciate it.